Limbo Lodge by Joan Aiken, Chapter 7. As they walked down the hill, the mist rose again and swirled about them. "How very lucky we were to have that interval of sunshine," said Herodsfoot happily. He seemed unaware of any atmosphere other than the mist, but Dido, walking between Yorka and Talisman, noticed Yorka give a quick glancing look upward at the doctor. Talisman's face remained completely blank. "Yes, it was a piece of luck," she said after a moment. "I suppose," Herodsfoot teased her, "that now that my name is written up in that rock face in your handwriting, you'd say that put me in your power? Would you say so? Because of your being a Kaniki? And that being such a sacred place? Are you trying to make fun of the things the forest people believe? I thought you sympathized with the forest people and understood their beliefs." "I do understand them, and I go halfway, well, 1/3 of the way, to sharing some of their beliefs. Isn't that enough? Nobody can share all of anybody else's beliefs. I know that one must be respectful, and on no account must one make fun of them. Isn't that enough?" Suddenly his voice, his face, had grown very anxious. "Dear Talisman, I believe in the Fairy Queen and Robin Goodfellow and King Oberon and the whole bag of tricks. I'll believe in the Fairy Queen and Robin Goodfellow and King Oberon and the whole bag of tricks, if only you won't be cross with me." "It was never my intention to—" "Oh," she cried out impatiently, "how I wish we had been obliged to come here. How I wish we had not been obliged to come here. The forest people are quite right. It is a bad luck place." The mist had dispersed by the time they reached the grove where the horses had been tethered, and they saw there was a woman, one of the forest people, waiting there. When she saw Talisman, she made a deep bow and then fell to her knees beseechingly. "Wise one, will you come to my wood show? It is my son, my little Oynat." She spoke the Delindi language. By now Dido understood enough to follow, and it seemed the doctor did too. "It is his eyes, Excellence. He sees nothing but devils. He is very much afraid. So are we all." "Yes, of course I will come." Talisman picked up her medical bag, which she had left with the horses. "How far is it?" "In the forest, too, perhaps 3 hours from here." Herodsfoot began to protest. "But what about our plan to go to Limbo Lodge?" "I must see what I can do for this woman's son," Talisman said patiently. "When I have done that, I will either join you this evening. Where do you spend the night?" "It is the house of a man called Ruiz, an Angrian, but he lives by himself in the forest," Herodsfoot said. "Tylo has been telling me about him. Well, if I can get there by midnight, I will find somebody to guide me, or I will come tomorrow morning." Herodsfoot seemed wholly dissatisfied with this plan, but Talisman had already mounted her mule. "Yorka, will you come with me, in case there is anything I don't understand?" Yorka nodded. "We can take it in turns to ride the mule." The three set off at a rapid trot going westwards. "I don't know, I wish—" Herodsfoot began uneasily. "Was that woman telling a true tale?" Tylo took no notice of this. "Best not stand here, lordship," he urged. "Come quick off this hill." It was plain that he regretted losing the company of Dr. Talisman. He looked after her sadly. He seemed to feel that her presence conferred some protection on the group. Dido was sorry too. Dr. Talisman was one of the most sensible people she had ever come across, and, despite the fact that Tylo was a shrewd boy and knew his way all about the island, Dido felt that Lord Herodsfoot, though he had a kind heart and engaging manners, was like a loose cannon on a ship's deck. There was simply no knowing where he would roll off to next. "It's lucky, at least, that most of the folks here seem to like him," she thought. "So tell me more about this Mario Ruiz fella," Dido asked Tylo as they jogged along at a winding gate, hung about with dangling creepers and frilled tree ferns. "Is he an Angrian? If he's an Angrian, why the dickens did he choose to live all on his lonesome in the forest? Does he have a spice plantation? Like the Arayas?" No, he humble fellow, not rich." "What does he live on? Hot spring near house. People sometime come, bathe, drink water. And pay him for that? I see. I wonder why he likes to live alone. He wife, he die. He a bit noodle-stricken, Tylo tapped his forehead. Bats in the belfry, you mean? I hope he's harmless. No and no, said Tylo. Dido reflected that people in Eritu whose wives died tended to grow peculiar. There was John King shutting himself up in Limbo Lodge, and this Ruiz choosing to settle in the jungle by a hot spring. Well, he sure fixed to live at the back of beyond. Their way now led them up a deep, narrow gorge with a watercourse beside the path, which was half hidden underneath juicy vegetation. Lord Herod's foot became very silent after Talisman left them, and rode for over 2 hours wrapped in thought. Coming out of this meditation at last, he suddenly asked Dido, Do you think she was angry with me? There could be no doubt who the she was he was referring to. Well, yes, I reckon she was a bit, said Dido bluntly. But why? Just for teasing her? Because she lays claim to magical powers? I mean, rarely, said Herod's foot. I'm sure she's a good doctor and a clever girl. But one has to draw the line somewhere, don't you think? My lord Oklosh, said Tylo positively. Doc Tally come soon. Been right up Kaniki. She learn touch troublestone, write true question on black sand. She learn do all these things with Aunt Ta'ala own sister to Night Woman. How can you be so sure? Herod's foot said skeptically. Pray, when is all this supposed to have taken place? When she see Aunt Ta'ala, time with Aunt Ta'ala go, Tylo made an expressive gesture, moving his hands back and forth. I don't see how all that could have happened just in one night, argued Herod's foot obstinately. Really? Surely she is just an ordinary person, like you and me and Dido here. After all, she only arrived on this island 2 days ago. She told me so. We ain't so blooming ordinary, Dido thought. I never before met anybody like Herod's foot here, or Tylo for that matter, and I guess I'm the only one on this island who comes from Battersea. There was a loud crack of thunder overhead, and a few heavy drops of rain began to splash down. I hope we ain't too far from the Wocho of this Ruiz fellow, Dido called to Tylo, who was riding about 20 yards ahead. Sounds like dirty weather coming up. Yes, we must make haste, he called back and kicked his pony into a canter. 10 seconds later, a terrifying thing happened. The whole cliffside on their left, loosened perhaps by storms, suddenly became detached and roared down onto the trail with an ear-splitting booming rumble, which reverberated up and down the narrow gully for several minutes after the first fall, as more and more fragments were dislodged from the rock face and followed the first landslide. The horses of Dido and Herod's foot screamed with terror and reared back from the huge pile of rock and earth, which now blocked the way. Save us! Gasped Dido. Tylo, where are you? No answer came back from the monstrous heap of smoking rubble in front of them. And at this moment the gathering storm broke in all its fury. Rain lashed down in torrents, tremendous gusts of wind battered them, thunder cracked and pealed overhead, blue-white lightning made the scene stand out in nightmarish clarity. Oh, my goodness gracious me, lamented Herod's foot. That poor unfortunate boy. I fear he has indubitably perished under this shocking avalanche. There is no way in the world that we can rescue him. It is only by the mercy of Providence that we ourselves do not likewise perish. He seemed likely to go on in this vein for some time, but Dido said, We'd best not stop here a-grieving and a-chewing it over, lordship. I'm as sorry as can be about Tylo. He was a right decent fella, but it ain't no ways healthy here. We'd best go back. No way of going forward, and more of the cliff above us looks likely to come down. You can see the nags ain't happy. I fear you are in the right, sighed Herod's foot. You do not think there is any chance that if we called the boy's name, he might be able to respond? Can try again, but I doubt it, Dido said. She yelled, Tylo! At the top of her lungs, so that her voice echoed between the sides of the ravine. The only result was that some more pieces of rock and soil came clattering down on the existing heap. No, mister, it ain't a bit of use. If he is there on the far side of that devilish tip, he can't hear us, not with all the ruckus going on. All we can do is make tracks ourselves before we're pounded into mincemeat. She turned her horse and set off at a fast clip. trusting to the beast to find his own footing, for the rain in her face blinded her. Herod's foot followed, letting out a stream of ejaculations and objurgations relating to the weather and the fate of Tylo and their own horrid plight. "What shall we do?" he kept demanding. "Whatever shall we do, Dido? Where shall we go now? What do you think is best to be done?" "Well," said Dido, "we have to find the house of this Ruiz, for that's where Doc Tally said she'd meet us, and I remember Tylo saying earlier that there were 2 ways to get there, and we'd take the quicker one. But he said there was another way over the top of the ridge. Best we go back and find that if we can. There was a clump of nutmeg shrubs where he was telling me that. I remember those, just at the turn-off point. Trouble is, everything looks so different with the rain slamming down." "You don't think we should endeavour to take shelter for a while from the elements?" suggested Lord Herodsfoot plaintively. The wind lashed them. The rain slapped them. Huge branches, tossing, impeded their path. "Nowhere to take shelter," returned Dido briefly, rubbing her eyes against the rain. She peered ahead. "Ho! I believe that's the nutmeg clump. Now we have to go up over the rise and then kind of bear right so as to get back toward where he was heading before. It's too bad the nags ain't in better heart." The horses were nervous and weary, upset by the storm. Arriving at a grove of tall, broad-leafed trees, Herodsfoot proposed again that they stop for a few minutes. "I believe the storm is abating," he pointed out hopefully. "A short respite may put new heart into our mounts." It soon appeared that Lord Herodsfoot had a personal motive for wishing to halt at that particular spot. The sky was clearing out, and he had recognized, up above them, the unmistakable outline of the place of stones. "Oh, I would give worlds, all the worlds I have to give to pay another visit to that remarkable sight." At this, Dido was really shocked. The loss of Tylo and their predicament seemed to her incontestable reasons why they should keep going and cover as much ground as they possibly could before dusk fell, in order to reach their destination in daylight. But Herodsfoot had already dismounted and fastened his reins to a tree. She did not dare let him go off on his own, for heaven only knew how long he would stay up there, measuring, sketching, taking notes, and then he would very likely go down the wrong side of the hill and get himself lost. So reluctant, disapproving, and irate, Dido followed him up the hill. One circumstance, she noticed, made the climb easier than it had been on their previous visit. The heavy rain had rinsed off the dust, which had formerly coated the rock surface. Although wet, it was not so slippery as it had been before, and the warm rock dried off quickly as soon as the rain ended. "We mustn't stop there longer than 5 minutes, Dido called, and wished with all her heart that Talisman were there to reinforce this command. Yes, very well, he muttered distractedly. I cannot tell you how very significant the arrangement of these stones appears to me, how closely related the pattern is. For instance, the game of Pong How Kai, or the game of Molnello Quadruplo. Mind you, there is grave doubt as to whether that game was ever actually played. According to report, each player had 5 men, which were entered in alternate turns of play. When all 5 were in place, they had the power of moving in any direction to a contiguous point. Herodsfoot's voice dried up. He came to a total stop. Dido, just behind him, observed that he had turned chalk white. He was staring at the ground as if he had seen a deadly snake. Coming up alongside, Dido too stared at the ground and found her own breathing suddenly blocked at a point somewhere between her chest and her throat. No air would go in, no air could come out. She leaned forward, put her hands on her knees, and managed with a gasp to inhale. On the dust, inscribed with a finger bone, just as Talisman had left them, were Herodsfoot's list of names: Algernon, Francis, Sebastian, Fortinbras, Carsluth, Baron Herodsfoot. Everywhere else, on the slightly dome-shaped surface of the place of stone, the dust had been washed, blown, swept, sluiced away by the storm. But just in this one spot, the surface of the rock was quite dry. The letters remained in the dust exactly as Talisman had written them. Dido picked up a great sodden yucca leaf, which had blown up the hill, and swiftly wiped the words away, scrubbing the ground hard until there was nothing to be seen but some streaks of wet grit. Come along, my lord, she said briskly. We must not waste any more time hereabouts. Dear knows how long it will take us to get from this place to where Mario Ruiz lives. She caught hold of Herodsfoot's hand and gave it a yank, obliging him to move away from the patch of ground where his name had been written. That's a dandy. Come along, those nags will soon take a chill as wet as they are, if they are left standing any longer, and we shall take a chill too. Gabbling out whatever random cautions and words of advice came into her head, she urged her companion back into the saddle and untied his horse's tether. Once he made as if to push his spectacles off by the earpiece, and she cried out sharply, "Don't do that, or you'll go and break them again." And he gave her a startled look and desisted. Otherwise, he seemed like a man in the grip of a nightmare or paralysis. He sat his horse, staring straight ahead, and made no attempt to guide it, leaving it to follow where Dido led. She found a kind of deer track which crossed over a shrubby hillside and then led down to lower ground. Over to the right of this route, she hoped, was the gorge they had been threading when the fatal landslide occurred. Did she make that happen, Dido wondered? Talisman? So he'd obliged to go back to the stone circle and see his name? Did she lay out the whole business on purpose to teach him a lesson? Somehow Dido could not believe this of Talisman. She might be impatient, yes, might lose her temper, yes, but to set a whole trap for the poor fellow, involving a storm, a landslide, and the loss of Tylo? No, surely not. Tally's a good person, Dido thought. So's he, for that matter. Not an ounce of harm in the poor dear gentleman. It's too bad they got across each other. Now the track ran down again into forest, thick, dark, and green. Dear only hope this is the right way, thought Dido apprehensively. For once we're in these trees, you can't tell which way you're going, north, south, east, or west. You might as well be in the main drain under Petticoat Lane. Don't I just wish I had one of them memory birds that the forest people take around with them? To her utter astonishment, no sooner had this thought framed itself than one of the little white pink-headed birds fluttered down out of the branches above and settled on her horse's brow band. "Well, I'll be jiggered!" gasped Dido. "Lord Herodsfoot! Frankie, look and see what's come!" He gave her a lackluster glance, hardly seeming to take in what she said, and rode on in silence. After a mile or two, he said, "Did you see those words, Dido, or did I dream them?" "No, the words were there, mister, sure enough," said Dido. "I reckon there's a lot more in Doc Tally than meets the eye. I guess you just got to put that in your kettle and boil it." Herodsfoot made a sound like a man who has just swallowed a raw egg ice cold. Why, he cried out woefully. Why can't she just be an ordinary person?" "Well, you got to face it, Frank. She ain't an ordinary person, and maybe if she were, you wouldn't fancy her so much." "I don't know. I just don't know," he said miserably. "I've traveled all over the globe. I possess a larger collection of ancient and interesting games than anybody else in the Western Hemisphere, but I never felt like this before, and I do not know what to do." "Best thing you can do," said Dido practically, "is to collect all your games together and get yourself off this plaguey island and back to Lunnon Town and cheer up poor old King Jamie. That's summat you can't do, and you're the only cove what can do it, seemingly. So that's what you must do, if we can get a hold of Cap Sanderson and the Sawara." And she sighed. Funny thing, she thought. When we were on the Sawara, Doc Tally didn't seem anything out of common. Of course, then she was putting on an act, letting on to be a man. Both Mr. Mully and I twigged that, and very likely Cap Sanderson did too, and thought it none of his affair. But then she was just like anybody else, seemingly an ordinary enough young fellow, me lad. It was coming ashore on Arrow too changed that. Doing that job on Mr. Mully in the hospital. Wonder how he's getting on. And that game with the bowl of water in Manuel's yard. It was then I began to feel that there was summat havey-cavey about her. No, not havey-cavey, but spookish. Maybe meeting Manuel again kind of twitched her. It must be a bit creepy to meet a fella that you're pretty sure once stuffed you in a clay pot and chucked you off the cliff of death. It'd sure make the cold slithers run down my back. And then, the night she put in with Yorker's auntie, the old Kanicki lady, I guess that was what really changed her. Fancy, Frankie, she said. I believe there's a house ahead of us. I reckon the memory bird brought us to Mr. Ruiz's residence. They were at the end of a long open glade. The customary fragrance of clove, cinnamon, degila, uka, and frangipani was now augmented by wood smoke and the savor of boiling meat. Dido remembered, not for the first time, that she was ravenously hungry. Mario Ruiz's house was perched against the slope of hill covered with tree ferns. It was neither in the Wocho nor the Angrian style of architecture, being long and low, solidly built of logs with a wooden shingled roof. The windows were screened, and there was a stout door. An open stable or shed was built on the end of the house. Patches of corn, okra, plantains, and coffee bushes grew in front of the building. Fruit trees grew beyond it. All seemed orderly and peaceful. A man sat reading on a sawed-off log near the front door. He was a tall, skinny individual, an Angrian, with bushy, rusty gray hair and a deeply lined, gloomy face. He stood up, bowed as they approached him, and addressed himself to Lord Herodsfoot. Greetings, Signor. Salutations. You do much honor to my poor residence. With a brief glance at Dido, Ruiz went on. Tell your peon to stable the horses in that barn. Allow me to offer you a glass of wine. This cove is supposed to be a bit off his rocker, Dido remembered. When I said that I hoped he was harmless, Tylo said... What did Tylo say? Still, the guy seems quiet and friendly enough. It sure is lucky how almost everybody does feel friendly to Frankie right off. I will say that for him. But oh, Tylo, where are you now? Reaching the stable, Dido received a shock, for there was Tylo's pony tied up, peacefully munching fodder along with a mule and a few goats. Dido's first impulse was to rush back to the house and find out if Tylo was there. Her next was to see to the horses and look about her, before following the two men indoors. If Tylo is here, she thought, he's all hunky-dory. The nag seems well enough, and it never does harm in a strange place to check around, take a gander, count the exits, and mark the loose floorboards. I wonder where the hot spring is that Tylo spoke of. Along there by the bank, maybe, where all those tall grasses and reeds are a-growing. Remembering the hot springs made her feel thirsty. She thought, here's a well. Anyhow, and a bucket on a rope. I'll take some water to the nags and drink a mouthful or two myself. Wouldn't trust the fellow's wine. I just hope Herodsfoot has the sense not to drink too much of it. She was about to lower the pail into the well when, looking over the stone coping that encircled it, she received an even more atrocious shock. Down below the rim, she could see the head of Tylo, just above the level of the water. Tylo! She gasped. He heard her, but could not reply. A bandage was tied over his mouth. Here, haul yourself up, whispered Dido, dropping the rope's end to him. But he shook his head and raised his hands. She could see that they were bound round and round, tightly together, with yards of cord. Krupus, I'll come down and get you. This proved not at all easy. The well was narrow. Dido had to undo the bucket and go down head first, binding herself to the well rope by a traveling loop, which, very fortunately, she had learned from a petty officer on HMS Thrush. Then, hanging head down, she had to undo Tylo's hands. The rope around his wrists was too tight, and by now soaked with water. For fingers to be of any use here, she had to work herself back up the rope, extract Herodsfoot's knife from his saddlebag, then slither down again and saw through the strands round Tylo's wrists. All this had to be done very quietly. She was terrified that Ruiz might come out and discover what was going on. Even after Tylo's wrists were free, his hands were at first too weak for him to be able to pull himself up, and Dido, hanging head down, was not able to do more than support his weight and rub his wrists until at last, by a few nods, he was able to assure her that now he thought he could climb out. Dido retreated up the rope, then lay flat on her stomach by the well, and helped haul Tylo upwards. With a huge gulp of joy and relief, she saw his bandaged head appear over the rim of the well and dragged him out on the grass. Then, with the knife, she cut off the gag over his mouth. "Golly, hey, oh, shocky miss!" he gasped. "Oh, Tylo!" They hugged each other frantically. Tylo was slippery, coated in slime, since he had been sunk in the mud at the bottom of the well up to his neck. "Think I sink much more too soon," he said. "Think I sink over here," and laid his hand across his eyes. "But why did that man do it?" "He noodle-stricken." "You can say that again." "He think his mother sent me." "Why the pest should he think that?" "Oh, why should that put him in a pucker?" "I bring him a bunch of toro fruit I see hang on vine." Tylo explained that the mother of Ruiz had once tried to poison him with toro fruit, or so he had thought at the time. So it was a most unfortunate piece of bad luck that Tylo happened to arrive carrying the same gift. Ruiz had at once gone berserk and flown at Tylo. He was as strong as a gorilla. "But maybe by now, golly likely, he forget all about me." "Tell you what," said Dido. "Put on one of Herod's Foot's shirts. I see he's got 2 spares in his saddlebag. Then you won't look the same, and most likely the cove won't recognize you." Tylo did this, laughing heartily and admiring himself, for the shirt was Lord Herodsfoot's best, with fine frilled cuffs. And then they went cautiously into the house. All indoors appeared entirely peaceful and orderly. It was plain that the first thing Herodsfoot had spotted in Ruiz's living room was a game board and a pack of cards. The 2 men were sitting at a small table, completely immersed in the game, which seemed very complicated, for it required cards, dice, ivory counters, as well as the board itself, which was marked out in squares. On each of these was a different emblem: hearts, anchors, crosses, horses' heads, bells, hammers, and swords. The men had glasses of wine beside them, but were so occupied with the game that neither player seemed to have taken more than a sip from his glass. A jug of wine stood on a shelf, a pail of water on the floor. Dido stepped quietly around behind Lord Herodsfoot, picked up his glass, and emptied it back into the jug. Tylo, with a nod, performed the same service for Ruiz. Then, sniffing the jug, he took it outside and emptied it on a plantain before refilling it with water. Dido began scanning the house for food. She found the meat that Ruiz had been cooking on a spit over the fire, but by now it was burned black and inedible. He had forgotten all about it, but there were some plantains, which she sliced and fried, and a loaf of cornbread, fruit, and a bowl of hard white goat's cheese. She wondered whether to disturb the 2 men at their game by offering them a meal, but Tylo in a whisper dissuaded her. "We eat, shocky miss. Let them play. Play game. Very teryak." He used a Valindi word that Dido had not heard before, but his gesture made its meaning quite plain. He smoothed his hands in curves in the air, as if calming a stormy sea, and Dido could see, for herself, that absorption in the game was quelling some of Herodsfoot's miserable feelings about Talisman, about how in the world she had contrived to preserve his name, mockingly written in the dust, through a tempest that had torn up whole trees and tossed boulders like peppercorns. Ruiz, likewise, seemed commendably calm and even cheerful. Every now and then he laughed with pleasure as some cunning move of his foiled one of Herodsfoot's gambits. It seemed he was the better player, not surprisingly, since he must spend most of his time playing this game against himself. Dido and Tylo enjoyed a sustaining meal. Then she persuaded him to lie down and sleep on Ruiz's bed, a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame. "I'll call you right off, Tylo, if there's any trouble," she whispered. "But I reckon you're in the right of it. The longer those fellows play, the better it'll be for 'em. You sleep now, and I'll get a bit of kip later." Tylo, who had suffered for at least 5 excruciating hours standing in the well, slowly sinking and not expecting to be rescued, was very glad of the chance to sleep, and nodded gratefully. Dido lit a teaberry candle, sat on a tree stump stool, and peacefully watched the 2 men, wondering how many hours the game would last. It lasted until dawn. Finally Ruiz shook his last dice, slapped down his last card, and swept all of the counters on the board. "I win, senor, but mother of light, what a game! The best I ever played. You are a champion player, my friend. I wish you might remain with me for a year. Alas, said Herod's Foot, there is nothing I would like better, my dear host, but I must return to my own land. The king there lies grievously sick, all for want of a game such as this, to raise his spirits and make the blood run more quickly through his veins. Then you must take him this one, cried Ruiz enthusiastically, pushing cards, counters, and dice into a leather bag. Take it as my gift to the king of your land. No, I must not do that, said Herod's Foot, though he looked extremely tempted. You are here alone in the forest. You need your game. I remember it. I will have a copy made. At this, Ruiz seemed mortally offended. His weathered face darkened to a dusky plum color. You do not take my gift, signor. I am dishonored. Oh, heavens, now what? Dido thought as Herod's Foot saying no to his offer. Was Herod's Foot saying no to his offer going to knock the cove off his perch again? Surreptitiously, she nudged Tylo and wished she was near enough to Herod's Foot to kick his ankle. She caught his eye and mouthed the words, "Take it." Ruiz glanced angrily about him. All the good effects of the game apparently wiped from his mind. Dido tensed her knees under her, preparing to spring across the room and grab his arm if he suddenly assaulted Herod's Foot. Then, just at that moment, there came a knock at the door and a voice. Two voices cried, "Hello there, is anybody at home?" And that is the end of chapter 7.